So this session will be one of the technical ones for DevOps for data infrastructure. To give you an introduction of who you're talking to. Partially the agenda first. There's been a cultural theme among all the sessions that we've hosted, and this is one that's more technical. But again, working in IT for as long as I have, this is a culture shift, so we'll cover some of these items. I won't read them off one by one, but you'll have adequate time for Q&A, and we can kind of be flexible about the path we take. So quick intro. My name is David Vanderslice. I'm a principal cloud solutions architect. I also handle a lot of the DevOps architecture projects here at Catapult Systems. I've been working in Azure for a long time and have seen my role change a lot since I started in the cloud. Before the cloud, I worked primarily in enterprise architecture, and then before that, engineering on premise. So it's been interesting to see the shift, and I'll talk a lot about that as the theme for this. Rather than just showing you a nifty new technical item, this is more understanding what you have in the cloud and how our paths and roles kind of shift as we delve into the DevOps space in Azure and any cloud provider. So the first concept let's talk about is DevOps and Data Ops. So I don't care if you're super familiar with DevOps and GitOps and just about any type of DevOps type framework. Traditionally, DevOps through the years, for myself working in it, was very much to service developers. And what do we think of when we think of developers? We think of application writers, code people, etc. And that was my role for many years before I started at Catapult Systems. Was I focused on architecture design and then deployment of code and tools to support our software. I happened to work for a software company, so obviously that was our main goal. But there was always a very niche role for DevOps. But as my role started developing, I noticed I was delving more and more into traditional DBA activities, which made me a little nervous because I didn't know T-SQL or anything to do with Databricks or any of these types of data platform services. I knew how to get things to connect and talk, and I knew how to get software deployed, but that was pretty much the realm of DevOps traditionally for myself and most others. As times have changed and data has now become our primary focus for just about everything. Any of the folks I work with on the infrastructure practice side can tell you we're primarily concerned with automating or manually deploying infrastructure for software and apps, but that has changed completely. Now we're deploying everything with data in mind, analytics. If you think of a architecture for a modern data warehouse, everything is consumers that sit on top of the data. So understanding data and how we can incorporate that into our more modern DevOps principles has been paramount, especially in recent times. So that's a lot of what we'll talk about is kind of how do we join those two processes? Because if you look at the data ops column, it's very much the more modern data scientists and data analysts and even the traditional DBA, they're the ones that handled the deployments when it came to data. And they were always kind of in a different lane. At least from my experience, it was always data deployments and the way that we dealt and modified and worked with data was very much a separate niche. And recently, that just doesn't serve the agility that we really need to deploy. I mean, bottom line, sure, DevOps, if you think of what you may know or do know about DevOps, it's meant to be a agile method, right? And it's supposed to be something that we're able to uh, limit the amount of operational effort that it requires to get our config or data or change to where it needs to go. So joining the two, what they've dubbed data ops, which I've never really liked that. They used to call it data DevOps, and but joining the two into just true DevOps to where folks, even on the data side, can understand what's happening in this column, and folks in this column can understand, so that we're melding it together. So how does that happen? So the main goal is to transform. If you've already got a very refined, tested, security may be involved, you have a true pipeline for getting your deployments done. How do we transform those to include the data items? We'll touch on a sample when we demo through this, but you can imagine that's a broad topic. If any of you are familiar with Azure, that's a really broad topic. If you think of machine learning, Spark, SAP, just all the tech that's out there in the cloud, how do we now mold that to fit into very traditional application dev and then DevOps on top of it? As well, one of the things that my counterpart and I really preach the gospel on is for our data and AI practice and infrastructure teams to understand how to deploy not just that niche area, but to deploy end-to-end environment as a service, as I like to call it, methodology. This understanding how simple it actually is and removing some of the daunting from that uh, will help this metamorphosis happen. And the last one is optimizing. Hopefully we'll have some time to touch on that a little more. So let's look at just a very traditional Azure DevOps pipeline. And you can see the data side is just kind of off in right field. There's a database there, but even the numbers related with the flow don't really talk about the data. That may include deploying the platform or the infrastructure, but there's nothing happening here. How does that data get there? And you'll find if you peruse documentation on very successful DevOps release pipelines and builds and the CI/CD portions in between, the data aspect has started to get more recognition, but there's really just, it's kind of a strange niche. It just almost didn't fit into a lot of the reference architecture design. It just, for whatever reason, I don't know if it's a cultural thing more than anything, but it was just very much specialized. And as the years have gone on with deployments, as I mentioned before, modern data warehousing has kind of become the norm for deployments, at least part of that dichotomy. And now it's forcing a lot of us on the infrastructure side, especially, to start thinking about how the activities happen to keep data fresh. How do we test off of it, just like we do in this pipeline? If you see, just, we don't have to go over every line, but if you see the items here, they very much create kind of a redundant testing, and the app insights goes in and we can test a lot of the end-to-end processes. But the goal is let's perform these same processes for our data activities. So here's one that's pretty common. There's some of our data team that's on the call. This has become the new norm for data ops and DevOps. So we're using, and some of the technology we'll demo here, but the idea is now we're following a little different flow when it comes to deploying. Machine learning in Azure, as I think you've heard about or will hear about today, has allowed us to create that new model, meaning the very DevOps app-centric model, but for data and analytics. This is one I grabbed because it's a common architecture or DevOps architecture that we see for some of our larger clients that have container services consuming machine learning or vice versa. You could see that the modeling uses ACAS, but this is obviously the extreme. But the main thing I want to illustrate is that if you look between these two, it's almost similar, but yet we've been operating kind of in a vacuum culturally where the two don't intersect. Let's talk about the infrastructure. So first off, how do we even get started with all this stuff I've been talking about? It's actually simpler, as I mentioned, than you would think. For this demo, we'll talk about a very specific use case as I grabbed it out of part of a reference architecture for a project that we worked on. But ideally, you really only need the things you probably already have or free tools. Obviously, an Azure account. We'll focus on Azure DevOps. We'll talk about Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio 2019 community. The only reason I list that is I'm older, I guess, but but I always use the SQL Server data tools in there. The interesting thing is Visual Studio Code is in itself kind of changed the game for a lot of these processes on how easily it is now to have a single pane of glass for DevOps in general and the tools available. I was talking to a coworker, and if you guys remember Microsoft Word in the old days, that had that Clippy would pop up and say, "Hey, it looks like you're writing a resume," and you'd say, "Yeah, yes, I am. This is great. This thing knows what I'm doing." Obviously, it was very rudimentary if you think of the code, but Visual Studio Code takes that type of where it actually can look at your project and say, "Hey, it looks like you need this extension, or you're working on this type of document. Here's the tools you need." Fantastic addition. One of my favorite things. I was a holdout for years on Visual Studio up until about the last year and a half, until I saw how incredible it was to work on Azure, AWS, even Google, and then all the internal items. So I highly recommend, if you haven't looked at it yet, Visual Studio Code is fantastic as a resource, as is Azure DevOps, as we'll spend a lot of time on. But I wanted to call that out. I know folks will agree that are familiar with it. It's just been a game changer because Visual Studio has always been very heavyweight, and whereas Visual Studio Code's very specialized. You don't need a lot of packages. I'm not getting paid by Microsoft to tell you that Visual Studio Code is good. I just wanted to put that out there. The big one we'll talk about to kind of bridge this gap we keep talking about is Azure DevOps. And it's gone through its changes, and I won't really discuss that too much, but it's been called different things, from Visual Studio Online to Visual Studio Team Services, and now it's Azure DevOps. And for those that this is completely new content for, Azure DevOps and Azure are completely different platforms. There's some areas where they overlap, But Azure DevOps, as it stands, is a true CI/CD / Scrum Agile based tool. It's the Visual Studio Code of that sector because it answers just about every use case that I know of for these. As I mentioned, worked in the DevOps area for a long time, and one thing we had to know was tools, with endless tools, Jenkins and TeamCity and GitHub, and then if your source control was something else, and then Microsoft had their own niche before Azure DevOps with Team Foundations, and so there was just so many tools. Azure DevOps, they really took the time to kind of go back to the to looking at what customers are trying to do, which is post-production and pre-production optimization, and try to have a tool that answers not just developer concerns, but guys like me, DevOps, and even non-DevOps folks, just being able as a project manager to be able to have your backlog managed and the like. Again, this isn't a plug for it, but what we'll focus on primarily will be the Azure pipelines and the repos, which is your source control. The board's not really in scope. So here's a pretty large, and I specialize this based on Microsoft Docs, but this is pretty daunting, right? For Sean Deegans is on this call, it's probably simple stuff for me, but for me, this is very daunting. You've got ETL, you have storage, you have your Databricks for your transformation items, and then you have your data tier. How do we reproduce this, or how do we even start? Right? There's a lot of resources flying around here. And what we'll do is let's actually take a portion of that, and I'll pause before we demo to just answer any questions and the like, because I want to make sure we have enough time. But the idea is, how do we take this type of model, and how do we translate this type of model to, true people and processes? And what I mean by that is, how do we not turn this exercise into just deployments take 12 different teams and roles to deploy? Instead, those same people are part of the design, but the DevOps portion of it can be driven by anybody that was part of that design and understood. And you could see there's some items we'll loosely touch on. Sorry, my allergies are killing me here. Like the Azure Data Factory integration and the like, but mostly we'll center around this one. And if you notice, that's the biggest one, and it's the best spot where we can demo what a solid pipeline will look like, at least the construct of it, and then some of the options that you have for creating even more items on top of it, or layers. So is there any questions kind of on the concepts that we discussed? We'll demo these items, by the way.
Yeah, David, I'm not seeing any questions yet.
Okay, good. All right. Let's go through the demo. And Sean, if you can do me a favor, let me know if the view is not too small for you. Is that zoomed in enough? I never can tell.
I think that's probably good.
Okay, good. So where do we start? If we go back to that actual slide, let's go back to it real quick. What are we going to do that kind of underlines these concepts here? So if you look at just some of these tasks, usually in most orgs that we work with at Catapult, and then I've worked with personally, these are all kind of different teams that may be involved, or you may have a cloud IT team that whose main goal, they'll deploy the infrastructure and it's static. And if you need something changed, you're going to have to get approval. What we're going to look at more is how do we create the environments we need just to test and then tear them down? And then how do we ping or trigger our QA folks, whoever they may be? You may not have a traditional QA environment, but how do we actually trigger the QA approval for items? And then for those items to be automated as well. And then so on and so forth. You can see it deploys into staging. There's approvals in between. How do we actually do that? And is this a complicated undertaking? And it can be if you make the design very complicated. So what I'd like to do is outline some of the tools that we can use to simplify this. And as I say, you don't have to be an infrastructure guru or thankfully, not a data scientist or wizard or whatever you want to call it. Because lucky for me, Microsoft makes the tooling pretty easy, even for non-DBAs like myself. So we'll go through deploying the infrastructure in one deployment. We won't do the Databricks. I found that the storage items, it just takes a while. So, but we will actually talk about some of them. We'll create the Azure SQL database. We'll build a DAC pack from a SQL project that I have staged so that we understand how that works. So how are we specializing the actual data? And we'll deploy the DevDB. We'll get the DB online. And then we'll trigger the QA portion where if there needs to be approval or there needs to be some visibility on what happened in dev, maybe you have to perform some tasks before they actually approve. Maybe you need to perform some tests. We can add those steps in, but that's the goal for this, is just to kind of give you the idea for the framework and what we approach as our modern data culture for our engagements with customers, not just on the DevOps side, but how we capture architecture and are mindful of cost savings, capturing your environments in code to allow you to have a true blueprint in your environment, and so on and so forth. All right, so talk that to death. So let's start with Azure DevOps. I included in the link. You could see this one is actually called my name. So if you actually go to dev.azure.com, you can create your own project for yourself for free. So you can play around with this stuff, which is how I at least learned a lot of it. So when you create a new project, we won't go over a lot of the semantics, but one of the big items is it'll create a repo or a source control item. And there's lots of items that I've included for showing this demo before. This is true data ops for modern data warehouse. And there's actually a person that demoed this on a YouTube channel that works for Microsoft that I had the pleasure of attending. And she's brilliant, so I borrowed some of her techniques here because it's really a fantastic showcase in less than an hour, similar to what we're covering now. So once you stand up your repository, this is where Visual Studio Code will come into play. When you first have a repository, you need to clone it to your machine. I do this for just about as kind of a reaction now, or a reflex. I create a new project for just about every engagement I work on. I find it's a nice way to store anything that has to do with what I'm trying to accomplish, primarily due to my role at Catapult Systems, but it's just a nice way to keep things organized and have a way to, of course, demo these things. This is my project. Obviously, if you're pushing products into production, I would recommend you use a shared space, but just FYI, Azure DevOps is that simple to onboard. There is an on-premise version you can install if you have, some orgs have very strict security rules, but FYI. And due to lack of time, I won't keep going. So the thing that we'll focus on is the pipeline. So what are pipelines? They've gone through a couple naming changes as well, but traditionally the pipeline, and this is changing actually, traditionally the pipeline was your build or your CI component, and releases were your CD component. And now that line's gotten grayed. But for this demo, we'll just work in those two areas. So what is the pipeline doing in our change? Well, we have, if we look at the source control that we have, here's, you could see here, Visual Studio Code. I hope you could see, it's hard to zoom in on this, so I won't stay on it too long. Visual Studio Code has a plugin right for the Git built into Azure DevOps or GitHub as well. You don't have to use just Git repos. You can use GitHub. So you can actually see the breakdown of what is actually in source control, so it's easy to work on. And you can see Visual Studio Code, just like Windows, detects what kind of file it is, and it breaks it down. So what we're going to actually look at is this file. We won't look at it long if it's too small, because we'll jump over. This is a YAML file. So YAML is the declarative language that's used for Azure DevOps pipelines, period, and releases loosely. You could see it probably, if it's the first time you're seeing this, you're like, what is this guy showing us? But the main goal of showing you this is it's taking a Visual Studio solution that's using SQL Server data tools, and it's packaging and publishing a DAC pack as an artifact. So let's talk about what that means. So if we click on this project, I just restarted it recently so you can actually see it. If we look, let's go back to the YAML so we can actually see it. So there's, maybe it's easier to view. I should have started here. Here's the actual YAML code. So who's going to drive the deployment? So Windows latest, that means that's the agent that Microsoft's using. Any variables, we'll touch on that more in a sec. The steps that it needs to perform. So it's pulling down NuGet packages, is very traditional stuff. It's building a SLM, which is a Visual Studio solution that has our SQL Server data tool project in it, and I'll show that real quick. I know it's probably small. One of the problems with getting high definition or ultra high definition monitors, and our test SQL project is in here, and it's very simple, right? Here's a breakdown. It's adding naming and design, etc., to the tables. So we're going to take that, and then what do we do with it? So if we create this, we run this, you see it's very source control specific. I'm just going to run it. And then what, right? So of course, in the pipeline, we could add, well, deploy it somewhere, or do a validation check that the schema is correct, or what have you, right? We can add just about any type of testing within that YAML code. That's harder to demo because we're just staring at lines of code. But what if we had it so when that DAC pack is created, it deploys something on the CD side, and not just deploys that DAC pack and pushes it on, which is simple enough, but actually deploys a SQL instance in Azure, sets up all the communication that you need on the network. Maybe it deploys it into a specialized resource group. It sends an email maybe when that happens, and we'll actually show how that works. So I created this release that gets triggered when we deploy the pipeline. So how does that work? And let's actually look at a new release just to see the breakdown. Excuse me, new release. You can see it's by default, there's all these options, and a lot of people jump right into them. God, this is what I have. I have a function app. I need that. For our purposes, we'll kind of keep it empty. But as you see, there's already built-in templates, just like for PowerPoint and Word and Excel, same concept. You have templates for deploying these items. And if I hit apply, it'll actually add the tasks, the most common tasks for those. For this, we'll just, so that we can dissect this, we'll just start with an empty job. So you start with two columns here, artifacts and stages. What does that mean? So an artifact is anything that's actually the source of what you're deploying. It can be GitHub. I think we have it linked to my GitHub. It can be an old team foundation version control, or it can be a build, which a build is that pipeline we talked about, or it can be the repository, or it could be all of these items. You may need items from, you may need a template or a Terraform project or what have you from somewhere else that you need to combine in this release, which is nice, right? So if we go back to that culture sample or example that I mentioned, you're now able to start using tools to bridge that cultural gap as well. So once the artifacts are defined, you can, of course, add a schedule to trigger it so that you don't even have to involve yourself in the build portion. But for our case, we will. So let's actually look at some other sections, and we'll come back to here. So variables are pipeline variables that we can actually create that can get pushed into our jobs or on the agent that runs them, meaning Microsoft has a agent that actually runs the tasks. Or we can have groups of variables. And for our case, we'll actually go a step further on how we secure our variables for our projects. So let's actually go back into our release pipeline. And before I go any further and run us out of time, any other questions or anything?
Hey, David, yeah, we did have a question. There was a question on subscriptions, right? So
Sure.
can we connect to multiple subscriptions in the same Azure DevOps pipeline?
Perfect. Yeah, perfect. That's a great, I didn't pay you to ask that if whoever asked. So let's open Azure DevOps in another section because we've been kind of going quick. So if we go into this project again, and let's just kind of get to our fresh setting. If we go to the project settings, you can see there's all these very traditional items, right? Who's the team that's working on them, which is what they call an Azure DevOps group, permissions. But related to that question, we have service connections. And you can see I already have some populated. So this is one subscription. And let's look at that because that's a really good item that we kind of went past. Is we have a subscription connected here. What if we wanted another subscription? We wanted our dev subscription, right? And then we wanted our production subscription on here, and then we wanted our QA. And maybe they're controlled. You could see we can control which pipelines actually have access. So when you create what they call a service connection, you can do it at the subscription level. You can do it at the management group level. So maybe all your products are organized into subscriptions, which I see a lot. We have customers with hundreds of subscriptions, and they have them organized into management groups, and each one has a dev, QA, pre-prod, maybe it's staging and production. So sometimes the management group level makes sense, and then sometimes machine learning has its own API that we can plug into. But for your question, we've got our dev subscription here. Maybe we want to add access to another subscription. So where is this actually coming from? Where are these? How does it know that I have? So it's actually pulling the token from my user account. So to be cognizant of it, whoever's setting up the project needs to have owner access on the subscription level. The reason being, well, let me just say, you only need owner access if you're going to try to use Azure DevOps to detect a lot of cases where we onboard Azure DevOps to customers. We only are supplied with very limited credentials, and we'll show that. But the answer is yes, we can have many subscriptions tied to the same project, and not, as you may have seen, not just Azure, Jenkins, Jira, Kubernetes, Service Fabric, and so on. The nice thing is that allows us, especially on the release side, to be able to call these directly. It's a good question. That was a very good one. All right, so back to the deployment, and let's just look real quick at the security side. So we've got all these variables here. So Azure DevOps releases and pipelines can call variables that are built into the pipeline, a pipeline variable or a release variable. You'll notice I have, very traditional ones I just put for a sample. Maybe you'll want to hard code the name of the database or the server because we know we're only deploying to one. But what if we're deploying to a lot of different SQL servers and we want it to obey our very traditional naming scheme? And as you'll see in the steps, we do just that. So for the dev environment portion of our pipeline, which is the scope, we have our dev environment nomenclature or prefix. And then for the QA environment portion, if we go back here again, we have our QA. And then if you notice here, we have a server name, but we only have one of those. But each environment, if you know Azure SQL especially, needs to have a unique name. So we're able to take, by using a $ in parentheses, we tell Azure DevOps, look at your variables, not anything that's in the code, but look at the actual pipeline variable and define which one you need. So when we're deploying in the dev environment, it's going to automatically see the dev one and QA. So I hope that makes sense. It's kind of a nice trick where we could combine these in all sorts of ways to make it so you don't have a dev deployment and pipeline, and then you have a QA pipeline for your data infrastructure. The other handy one is variable groups. So for this project, if we jump back over, and I deployed it, and we'll deploy it again, but we created a key vault. So key vault, if we go back to that slide that we showed, if you notice, I'll bring it up real quick. You'll notice that the key vaults are different per environment. And I usually suggest that. And that doesn't mean that they're in just different subscriptions. They just have different access policies, maybe. A popular DevOps practice is to keep the key vaults in secret names the same, but the values different so that you can use some process to keep them uniform. So we have this key vault. I don't have enough time to teach on key vault, but one nice thing is it uses version controlled secrets. So what we'll do for this pipeline is we have these two secrets. We have one for our Azure SQL password, and I'm a stickler. I have one even for the username. I don't know if you need to make that secure, but but you did, but I did. And then what I did was, when you set up that service connection that you asked questions about, we give it access to the key vault. And by doing that, we jump back over here, we can select, and this is actually a good spot here. We can set, so this is the dev key vault. Actually, let's actually look at real quick on how to sync ones. So if we created a new one, we want to link secrets. Same process as that service connection, just more granular. You can select what subscription contains the key vault, and then the actual name of the key vault. And when you do that, it'll populate a section for variables. And there's one additional step you have to add, and you notice it's now read the secret name and content type that I just shared on the Azure portal with you. So here's the password, here's the username. We can hit OK and save that, and then we can link it to our release back here. So that's what this link variable group does. And you'll see I can't see the password. So I just happen to be the project owner, but if I was just a user that doesn't have access, we're able to deploy your passwords and secure strings and certificates, mind you, from in here without the user that's the deployer having any of that information. Let's head back. So for this project, I've got the repo set up. That's what this icon. And then I have that pipeline, as we referenced before. So that build DAC I called it for an alias, which is actually just that name of that pipeline we deployed before, is another resource, and we can add CD on it. So every time that build runs, it deploys. I have a lot of customers that create their environment on a daily trigger, and at the end of the day, there's another trigger to tear it down. It's very simple to do here. So what are we actually doing in the deployment? So this is a very simple one. If you ever hit the plus sign here, you can see there's hundreds of Microsoft options for built-in releases, and then there's third-party ones that are approved, kind of like your Google Store, iTunes Store, Apple Store. There's just tons of options. For these, we'll start with the infrastructure as a code. So what is this doing? This is the deployment scope, is the resource group. This is that service connection that we looked at before. If we wanted to have another service connection, we can have it on the same pipeline. What subscription? It's creating or updating a resource group, which is kind of a misnomer because it's actually deploying on top of that. What this is the actual template that it's linked to. So this portion's actually looking at the source control. And then you'll notice, for those that are familiar with ARM templates, I rarely use parameter files when it comes to Azure DevOps. That's because you can actually use Azure DevOps to look at what parameters are actually in that template. And you'll notice there's my $sign in parentheses. I'm calling those values. So here's the two from Key Vault, and here's the one that we had in the pipeline. And away it goes. That way, every stage can have the exact same, we can clone this task and have it on the QA side. Last thing, and then the DAC files, same process. We're able to push that along. Right after we've deployed the SQL Server, the SQL Server is deployed to allow the Azure DevOps access, and away we go. So let's take a look real quick, and then I'll open it up for any other questions. let's actually go back real quick. So you can see after the dev is done, we have an approval. I don't recommend the deployer being an approval or approver, but this could be your QA folks. And look, it has 30 days for them to test on the dev side before it gets deployed into QA. You can do the same thing for post deployment approvals. So somebody actually comes in and does a post deployment. You might do that in dev too, before you kick it over to the QA team. So once it's deployed, I have it sitting in the queue right now. You could see it pulled the artifact for the build. It pulled the artifacts from the repo. It pulled the values from the key vault. And like we mentioned, we don't see any of those values. For this one, just to show you, it populated and logged everything that it populated on the SQL server after it deployed it. So I'll leave it like here for any questions.
David, it doesn't look like we have any questions from the group, but can you talk a little bit about like the data itself? When I do a DAC pack and there's already data on the system, how does it manage that?
Well, that's a good question. So for this deployment, it doesn't do it incrementally, right? Is there a way to define if it's actually incremental deployments? That's a good question. So here in this code, it wipes it out, right? That's so if you need to load a incremental deployment, that would be another method as far as I know. Is there arguments that you can add into here? You'd probably know better than I would. Yes.
Yeah, you actually can. So if you want to have pre-build and post-build scripts, you can actually build those into your SQL solution.
Right.
Where you can load data, but then the actual DAC pack process itself does a handshake, and it will go ahead and push the DAC pack file out to the SQL server if there's already a file there, as long as it's not deleting any data. So if you don't delete any columns or anything like that, it'll push it out there and it'll keep that data in place.
Yeah, and that's similar to the infrastructure method, right? Of incremental or complete.
Yeah.
That was a good question. I've actually seen the reason I chuckled on that is I've seen some things go wrong on the deployments where it just does a full deploy and the older data is gone. So that's a good thing. So after it's deployed, let's head over into the resource group just so we can kind of overlay what Sean just mentioned. Here's our two resources. If we look at the actual database we pushed to, you can actually see when I did it before. And on the activity log, you can actually see it performing the update. And like Sean said, this is where on the Azure side, there's not a lot of control. It needs to actually happen within the project itself, right? To where your project is dictating what it's going to do with existing data if it matches, right, or if it's new, to differentially deploy rather than just full like you would in the backup world. The last thing I'll touch on, since I guess we have 10 minutes, right? If we have no questions.
We do, and no questions so far.
Okay. So the last thing I'll touch on is, where did I get all this code? Did I just write it in between meetings? One of the practices that we're keen on educating on and practicing ourselves is defining, like I mentioned, your infrastructure as code. So if we look at this SQL server, how did I write the JSON? So if we go to the actual SQL deployment, did I go through and write this? Sure, you could download, there's Azure Quick Start, but if you had a more complicated set of infrastructure you needed to deploy on top of all this stuff that Sean gets paid the big bucks to do, how do we join those two together, which is kind of the theme, right? So one of the things is we capture any of these resources can either, if you manually deployed it and there's no going back from there, you haven't authored what these, you didn't author them in infrastructure as a code, whether it's Terraform or CloudFormations or PowerShell or however you did it beforehand. How do we actually capture this? Especially if you have a large environment that has all this data infrastructure, and you want to create a dev test validation area for maybe there's just so many settings that the infrastructure team set up, or there's so many settings that the data team set up. How do we add those all into one spot? The best way I have found is, thanks to Azure DevOps, we're able to use the Azure platform to actually look at what's defined and capture this into our template. It's very specialized when you do that. So if we download this thing and look at it, yeah, it's got our tags on there. Our collation is static. Properties are static. The even the parameters are named in not a really conducive manner to specialize easily. And if I scroll this up a little bit, if you could see it, the server name is the only parameter. So the first step I usually go through is try to understand what's on the infrastructure that makes sense. And you can see there's even items for the advisors API that you may or may not need. That's the first real step to get the infrastructure coded, just like you would with your the DAC pack example. We're going to specialize it and generalize it at the same time. And what I mean by that is maybe you deploy things to east and west. So maybe we need a parameter for that. Maybe you're worried the API version is going to change. So you might have a variable or parameter for that. And once it's actually not a very tedious process using Visual Studio Code, because you can see I have an ARM template outline, what resources are there, and you can see there's all these maybe tasks you may or may not need. Here's your geo backup policies, etc. Once you've got that saved, that's it. That becomes your seal of or stamp of approval for your environment, which is huge. It's a huge accomplishment in the first step. That said, you don't have to include infrastructure in your deployments. You may only include portions of the infrastructure, or maybe none at all. I've had some interesting ones where I've needed to just automate creating firewall rules for Azure SQL Server, or I needed to have a managed instance configuration changed during a deployment. So it may not be an ARM template just deploying net new or incremental deploys of infrastructure. It may be just a configuration item that needs to coincide with some sort of DAC pack push, or something on the Databricks or your ML workspaces that needs to coincide. And that's why I kind of bring that up. Having the understanding, even if you're not an infrastructure person, about how this is all defined on the Azure side, it's the first step that gives the understanding of what's being deployed, can be manipulated, And then on the other side, you could start capturing your environments in pipelines that create them. You guys work on them and spin them down. And then the first thing that happens is your costs are reduced heavily for lower environments. That's always our low-hanging fruit for these, is to remove the cost overhead for low environments, no matter how big they are, by just deploying them on a schedule. If it takes a couple hours to deploy it, like a managed instance, have the trigger set before the day starts and have it spin down, or even spin them up, as Sean knows, just spin them up on during a particular validation set of events that need to occur. Maybe it's just an event. The idea is to be able to bridge that gap and use Azure DevOps to kind of be the driver for that. All right, that was a lot of stuff.
Thanks, David. I don't see that we have any other questions. We probably do want to. Do you want to bring up the end of the slide stuff?
Oh yeah,
the good marketing stuff. We can talk about that.
Sure. You don't want to talk about the data warehouse. So these are the items, and I guess we'll be sharing all this, but these are the items I just talked about. Environment as a service, especially for data ops, is huge. A lot of things remain static. If you have a data lake, we're not going to redeploy that and copy files every day, but maybe the consumer infrastructure could be off unless you need it, or for validation or analytic testing, and data science really can use nice one-touch self-service deployments. Through the Q&A. So here's how we structure our DevOps innovation workshops that are very particular to you. I gave you an example of how we perform DevOps for our data infrastructure with just a very small sample, but you may have other questions, or you may want to figure out how to get started or how to refine your processes. One of the big ones that we see a lot of are Kubernetes and container management lately, not to mention all the ML ops and Synapse and all the new things that we can do on the data side. These workshops are highly valuable. They're very specialized to you, so I would recommend, if you are interested in this for your group, whether basic or very intensive, this kind of fits the bill.